Yep, it's a movie made by Dr. Seuss. And we're not talking about an adaptation of a Dr. Seuss book like this amazing book, which was made into a pretty good short film in 1972. This book is from 1971. Of course, it was also turned into a Disney movie in 2012, The Lorax by Disney. The Lorax, starring Zac Efron, kind of sums up the world we're living in these days. I'm not sure that there is really enough content in any of Dr. Seuss's books to make a feature-length film from them without taking a lot of liberties, without inserting a lot of Hollywoodisms. But what would it be like if Dr. Seuss really made a movie himself, if he wrote the whole thing? Well, The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T is exactly that. And I think it's really your only chance to answer that question, because this movie, sadly, was a flop. And Seuss, real name Theodore Geisel, of course, he never made another movie himself. And I'm not sure there's really any other movies like this. This is a live-action movie, by the way. None of these other adaptations were. So this is kind of out there on its own in some ways. Is it any good? Well, we'll get to that. But first, a little bit of context. In my head, I kind of think of all of Dr. Seuss's books as being from the 1950s, but that is not the case. In fact, when this movie came out in 1953, none of the Dr. Seuss books that I read growing up would have been published yet. Horton Hears a Who came out the year later. The Cat in the Hat, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, those are both from 1957. He wrote some more books in the 60s. The Butter Battle book is from 1981. That makes sense with the Cold War storyline, although I guess the Cold War had already started back in 1953. Oh, the Places You'll Go is from 1990, sort of a backward-looking book in some ways, and Dr. Seuss died, of course, in 1991. Sadly, I was never alive to experience the joyous feeling of Dr. Seuss dropping a new book. But you don't have to be that much older than me to have been around when Oh, the Places You'll Go came out. Of course, he wrote a lot more books than that, and he had published a number of them by 1953. But I think more than anything, the opportunity to make this movie came from the success of a short film called Gerald McBoing Boing, which is actually, it's a lovely short film. You can find it on YouTube, and you should check it out. It won an Academy Award, and it cracked open the door for Dr. Seuss to make a feature film, I think. There's not much to say about the cast and the crew here. The film was produced by Stanley Kramer, believe it or not, although it seems like maybe there was some tension within this production company that might have sabotaged the movie a little bit. I haven't heard of a single one of the actors here, or the director, or anyone else involved with the movie. This movie has a fairly novel plot, especially considering that it's a kid's movie. Well, it's a movie with a kid in it. I'm not exactly sure if it is a great movie for children. I'm not great at judging that sort of thing. It's maybe a little bit more extreme than you might expect. I think most of the audience of this channel are adults, so you probably have nothing to worry about. There's a kid named Bart at the center of the film. Once again, The Simpsons predicts the future. Of course, Theodore Geisel was born in Springfield. Mainly, we see a dream that Bart is having. That's 90% of the movie. But we get a glimpse of his real life, too, where he's being terrorized by a tyrannical piano teacher. He doesn't want to practice, basically, but the teacher and his mother really want him to. Okay, in the dream, this teacher is sort of converted into the fiendish Dr. Terwilliger. No relation to Robert Terwilliger, aka Sideshow Bob, that character, of course, named after a street in Portland, Oregon. This maniacal Dr. T presides over some sort of castle-like music school, although it also seems a bit like it could be its own country, not just its own castle or not just its own music education program. It's quite industrial and a bit nationalistic in some ways. Anyway, the center of this castle is an enormous piano, very long piano. You may wonder, on an enormous piano, on a long piano, does the scale repeat again and again and again? Or are there extremely high and extremely low notes? Well, in this case, it's the first one. Sorry to disappoint you. Dr. T has some scheme to have 500 kids play a song together, and that is where the 5,000 fingers in the title come from. Does the plot of this movie make a lot of sense? In some ways, not really. It's a little weird, but honestly, very easy movie to follow. Not as strange as I think some people might say. To many people, music education might seem like really a virtuous thing. So why is the villain here a piano teacher? This movie is really homing in on a certain type of music thing, practicing for the sake of it, practicing to build discipline, practicing to make your college applications look better. And again, I mean, that's not the worst thing in the world, but I do think it's a little bit in opposition to playing music to create, to have fun, or for the love of music. I think it's pretty common for people who are forced to play an instrument early on to leave it behind later in life. I won't go into my whole backstory with music. Maybe you can guess something about it. Wow, he owns musical instruments. But this kind of resonates with me. Of course, having the piano teacher be this authoritarian figure, it's still a little bit extreme, but remember that this is happening in Bart's imagination. At the beginning of the movie, he looks right at the camera and tells the audience that his piano teacher is the only villain in his life. Okay, we probably should talk about style here. It's kind of the defining thing of this movie. You might have a little bit of an assumption that if you want extreme style, if you want to see a movie that does weird stuff, you got to find a famous auteur director. Everybody else was just going to be following the Hollywood playbook, doing standard things. Well, not Roy Rowland, the director, whoever that is. I mentioned already that the kid breaks the fourth wall. That's one of the least extreme things in this movie, actually. The film takes place in his dreamscape, like I said, which is the world of Dr. Seuss. There's crazy architecture. Bart climbs up an almost infinite ladder. At one point, he walks by all these signs that have hands pointing in one direction or another, like an arrow sign, but it's a hand, right? Exactly the kind of thing you would see in a Dr. Seuss book. A lot of the backdrops look like they came right out of his, work. Now, when I was first watching the movie, I did think that the colors were more muted than expected, and maybe the set's a little bit less detailed, a little more barren. I'm used to Dr. Seuss stuff being bright like this. But remember, sorry, I sneeze when I'm exposed to so much light sometimes. Anyway, remember this movie is from 1953, and if you actually look at some of Dr. Seuss's earlier work, some of his work from that time, a lot of the stuff does have more muted tones and does match up with what's in this movie pretty closely. The special effects in this movie are pretty good, really, especially for a movie that most people have never really heard of. You can tell that there's a lot of matte painting going on, but I think that fits the style of the film pretty well. And what would maybe seem like a limitation in some context is more of an artistic embellishment here. It's a strength, really. Like I said, this is the only live-action Dr. Seuss movie, I think, and you wonder, how's that going to work? The dream sequences are an interesting composite of a picture book world and real actors. That kind of thing often doesn't really come off that well, but I think this movie is a pretty good entry. Anyway, there's a lot of great sort of surreal stuff going on in this movie. Surreal's not quite the right word, I think, but some interesting things happening. For instance, two of Terwilliger's henchmen are twin brothers that are joined by a shared beard. They fight against Bart's adopted father on roller skates at one point, and this is a genuinely great scene, in my opinion, with some virtuosic physicality, a lot of clever, unexpected moments. There's a lot of clever stuff in this movie. Dr. Terwilliger, he sleeps with a metronome above his bed, clicking back and forth. If the metronome stops, he tosses and turns. He nearly wakes up. Great little detail. The metronome becomes a bit of a plot device. A cool movie. You can tell that, this is really different from these Hollywood adaptations of Dr. Seuss books that tried to take kind of the Dr. Seuss images and clamp, and sort of the loose moral idea of Dr. Seuss, and kind of clamp on all this sort of like artificial mainstream storyline. This is a much more whimsical idea, much more creative kind of thing, coming from a similar mind. The price you pay is that in some ways the movie is a little bit loosely constructed. In some ways the plot is goes out to lunch a few times, but you can tell that Dr. Seuss was the one who wrote this movie. At one point, Bart finds himself in a dungeon in the basement of the castle where Dr. T has imprisoned all the musicians that don't play the piano. Can you believe that? And we get a performance from these guys as they play all kinds of strange Seussian instruments. And I'm not talking about a sousaphone. This is another great scene. It really feels like, yes, this is what a Dr. Seuss movie is all about. Weird instruments. I don't know. It's cool. This is a musical, by the way, although I don't think there's any music in the first third of the movie. You might not realize that at first. Surely one of the virtues of the 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T is that it is kind of wacky, right? Kind of creative. There's nothing else like it. Actually, there are other things like it. Or at least there are some ways to understand this movie in the context of Hollywood. And hopefully now I will demonstrate why I have a YouTube channel. The clearest touch point back to classic Hollywood are these musical numbers. The sets are pretty zany. The costumes are a bit zany. But when we get to the musical numbers, the staging feels really familiar. The same camera angles, the same crane shots that you would see in a lot of musicals, the same kind of set design, and costuming kinds of things. You can really tell that this movie was filmed on sound stages. There's a particular look to these classic Hollywood stages, flat lighting, somewhat artificial horizon, only filming in certain directions, a sort of proscenium effect. This stuff defines not just the musical numbers in this movie, but really the whole dream sequence. It's kind of an extended musical number in some ways. In these dream sequences, we never go outside. The whole thing takes place in this interior void that is almost an endless space. The soundstage, it's almost like this special, unbounded space. But no, actually, you can see the corner over there. You can kind of see where the wall is, and you can kind of see how the horizon is being faked, and you can kind of see, oh, that's a bit of a painting, right? This is a pretty common thing, the sound stage. And this movie, I think, is really kind of grounded in that in some ways. Let me go one step further. There's one particular musical that I think really influenced this movie. Well, I wouldn't say it influenced it exactly. More like there's a scene that's kind of ripped off from another movie, which is Singin' in the Rain, which came out in 1952, right before this movie. There's a scene where Bart's mother, sporting a hairdo and an outfit very similar to Debbie Reynolds, sings a song about the weather with two other people. And it reminds me a lot of the Good Morning song in Singin' in the Rain. I mentioned the roller skates earlier. There's no roller skates in Singin' in the Rain, but both Gene Kelly and Donald O'Connor had pretty famous roller skating scenes in other movies from similar time frame. If you watch this movie today, this skating scene I mentioned earlier might seem like totally wild. It is a bit out there, but it's also using a pretty common musical vocabulary. You might also ask yourself if these characters are sort of ethnically coded in some ways. In truth, a lot of the movie is using this kind of musical vocabulary. Like I said, the staging, the angles, the costuming, the way the special effects work. It doesn't feel quite as wild as I maybe expected it to once you realize that, oh, kind of just a musical. That said, this is still a pretty cool movie. I do think this film is ahead of its time in some ways. It reminds me a lot of something like The Phantom Tollbooth or The Point, which I reviewed on this channel. Those are both kind of hip, groovy kids movies, but they're both from the early 70s, 1970 and 1971, I think. And it is surprising to me to find kind of a groovy kids movie in 1953. I don't know if there's something else that I would put into that category exactly from this time frame. A few more notes before I tell you what I think of this movie. First of all, the role of the mother in this film is kind of interesting. Bart has a single mother that Terwilliger wants to marry, it seems. And this is kind of an interesting dynamic. In the real life sequences, the mother is in league with Dr. T because she wants Bart to practice. She's not a bad guy, but she's sort of on the wrong side of history, according to Bart. Now, in the dream sequence, it's a little more extreme. She's second in command at this sinister piano castle. A little bit darker, but she is still his mom, sort of. It's an interesting position they put her in here. One of the mechanics that they use is that she's kind of under some kind of spell. Bart talks about hypnosis. It's pretty vague what's going on here, but she seems to be hypnotized by Dr. T or something like that. Dr. T kind of has like mystical powers in some ways. It's a little vague, but it's an interesting mechanic. Like I said, hypnosis being the cornerstone of a strong relationship. Hypnosis in the domestic life. Is this saying something more broadly about the 1950s household? I'm not sure. What message would that be? I don't know exactly. Maybe it's not so different than that classic Hollywood plotline where the woman is going to marry the rich guy, but at the last second she decides to marry the poor guy. In those movies, the impetus is usually on the woman to see clearly. But with this hypnosis thing, the moral balance is a little bit different. It's kind of nice in this movie that it's the kid, Bart, who helps the adults to see. It's he who is sort of the moral compass in some ways. Of course, this is also pretty unrealistic, but hey, the feeling is there. Speaking of the rich guy and the poor guy, there's another man in the movie, and it's the plumber. This character is coded as Polish, I guess, and he's one of the good guys. It feels kind of forward-thinking to have this blue-collar hero, but there are some interesting things going on in this movie with how some of the other characters are coded. I mentioned the skating twins already. This movie has a lot of vaguely international cues in it. For instance, the musicians imprisoned in the dungeon seem maybe kind of Eastern European. We hear at one point about the currents the currency used at the piano castle. And again, it's piano castle is its own country, right? It has its own currency, its own industry. Anyway, they have a fairly convoluted monetary system here, as tends to be the case in Dr. Seuss creations. I think one of the denominations they have is called the drachmid or something like that. Sounds kind of similar to the drachma in Greece. Some of the other ones are a little bit more outlandish. Dr. Seuss's work does tend to be global in a very 1950s way. A number of his books are no longer published, mainly because of insensitive portrayals of non-Western characters. A fairly famous piece of revisionist trivia is that Dr. Seuss endorsed Japanese internment. There's an interesting survey from 1942 that shows that only 1% of Americans, 1% of Americans were opposed to internment of Japanese immigrants. 25% opposed to internment of Japanese citizens. Pretty dicey. Just one survey, of course. Dr. Seuss worked in the animation and film department of the United States Army during World War II. He was a political cartoonist as well, and for better or worse, mostly for better, I think, to be honest, he took some of these ideas into his later work. It seems like he may have changed his mind about Japanese internment later. Dr. Seuss, in many ways, very progressive, but that's one thing people have grappled with a little bit. All this is to say that there is an Eastern tinge to some of the villains. The villains in this film, I mentioned the hypnosis, for instance. Interesting. If you compare this to Charlie Chan or the Fu Manchu movies, or really any television show made during the Cold War, it's not going to seem that extreme, I think. Really, the bigger story, the thing that's maybe more in the foreground, is just the question of how World War II is reflected in the movie. This idea of a tyrannical leader, this castle that's more like a country, this strange intersection with the American domestic. Towards the end of the movie, they bring in the 500 kids, the 500 American Boy Scouts, to this castle to play the piano. The American domestic life is somehow caught up in this big, somewhat macabre nation thing. Is this almost a meta comment about the way that the war came to the home front, was carried out in America on the home front in some sort of cultural battle for purity and nationalism? Maybe. I don't know. The last thing I'll mention is that there is a satirical, almost playful invocation of the atomic age. Bart and the plumber, towards the end of the movie, build this sort of mystical contraption that captures sound. And the plumber says, careful, it may be atomic. And later on, when they show it to Dr. T, he says, oh, is that atomic? It's a fun moment. It's a fun moment. And it's again sort of interesting to see how this connects to the war in some degrees, because what I was just describing was maybe you might at first think that this is kind of a fearful movie, a movie that is invested in the seriousness of this kind of World War II paradigm and this emerging Cold War paradigm. But this sort of playful atomic thing kind of punctures that. In some ways, it's a little hard to know what to make of that. Is this attempting to lampoon a certain slightly Eastern-coded government? Unclear. Like I said, it ties in pretty closely to the American public as well. At the very least, this atomic stuff, it's a pretty clear pointer to the war. Like I said, no mystery that Geisel was influenced by his time working with the army and by his time being on the political battlegrounds as a cartoonist. You can see that in this movie, but certainly there's a looseness here. Not exactly an obvious conclusion, which may be for the better. Okay, the big question, is this movie actually any good? I think so. Yeah.